We're going to start in about a minute, so it would be great if all of you could get comfortable and find a seat. It's free seating for today's event. Very good morning, everyone. And a very warm welcome to all of you here. My name is Hilda, and I'll be an MC for today. And on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank everyone for taking time out from your busy schedules to join us for this event today. And the title for this event is, of course, the role of governments, monetary authorities, and the private sector in directing SDG-sensitive investments, insights from Singapore. SDG, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. It's really fantastic that we have close to 300 of you that have joined us online. As you know, the title of our policy dialogue is really about, having an insightful and exciting dialogue in Singapore, and it aims to foster and strengthen South-South exchange of experience by distilling lessons and strategic measures undertaken by the government of Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the private sector to strengthen the country's institutional framework and financial market environment that encourages ESG and SDG-sensitive investments. So we have a very exciting lineup of speakers for you today, but before we proceed any further, I would just like to kindly remind everyone to keep your mask on at all times, including the speakers, and also to keep your mobile phones on silent mode throughout the course of this event, so that we don't have, just to ensure that it goes smoothly and there are no distractions for the speakers. We would like to now kick off the dialogue with a few words from the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan.
Ms. Usha Rao Munari, the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Associate Administrator for the United Nations Development Programme. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to deliver the opening remarks for this dialogue. The theme of promoting sustainable development goal-sensitive investments is most apt. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a major setback for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Even before the pandemic struck, progress towards the 17 SDGs was already patchy. Progress has now slowed even further, and in some cases, seen reversals. The numbers from the latest Sustainable Development Goals Report 2021 are cause for concern. Global extreme poverty rose for the first time since 1998. Between 119 and 124 million people have been pushed back into poverty and chronic hunger. As we recover from the pandemic, we must build back our societies in a more resilient and sustainable way. And this will not be easy. Beyond tighter fiscal constraints, there are other broader challenges. For example, our current consumption of the finite planetary resources is unsustainable. Our water, sanitation, food supply infrastructure remain inadequate and vulnerable in many parts of the world. The pandemic has also exposed and exacerbated problems such as inequality within and between nations. If we do not address these issues head-on, our world will not have the capacity to tackle greater challenges like climate change or future pandemics. The SDGs have been an important roadmap for humanity as agreed by over 190 countries in 2015. The development gaps which the pandemic revealed are precisely the challenges which the SDGs aim to address. What we need now is more effective mobilization of financing for SDG-sensitive investments to fill these development gaps, especially when fiscal resources have become more constrained due to the pandemic. Finance plays an essential role in channeling resources to the right priorities, and the need for sustainable financing is great. The good news is that banks and investors are increasingly taking environmental, social, and governance factors, or ESG for short, into account when deciding where to invest. About 1/5 of all assets worldwide are now in funds that use some form of ESG criteria. For example, The Monetary Authority of Singapore, the MAS, has committed US $1.8 billion of its reserves to climate-related investments. However, the current global level of SDG investment is far from sufficient. According to the OECD, an estimated US $7 trillion in infrastructure investments is needed each year till 2030 to meet climate and development objectives. ASEAN alone will need an estimated US $200 billion in green investments annually through 2030 in order to achieve long-term sustainable economic growth. The challenges in enhancing sustainable financing are well known. First, many companies do not keep reliable or transparent climate-related data such as their projects' emission trajectories or energy consumption. Climate-related financial disclosure standards are still being developed. These gaps can give room for selective reporting and inconsistent disclosures by companies, making it difficult for investors to make SDG-sensitive decisions. Second, there is no common definition or taxonomy for activities that contribute to climate goals. Without a common understanding of what activities are green, cross-border green finance flows will be constrained. Third, many companies lack the expertise to quantify environmental costs and the benefits of their projects. This is where governments, monetary authorities, and the private sector need to work together to create an ecosystem for sustainable financing to take off. Each has a role to play. Let me elaborate. First, governments must lead the way by laying out the vision, the framework, and the rules for sustainable financing. In Singapore, the government launched the Singapore Green Plan 2030 in 2021, an ambitious long-term plan to build a green, livable, and sustainable future, which covers areas from our infrastructure, urban planning, and to building a green economy. This clear direction sends a message to the private sector to shift their investment position and to recognize that ESG is consistent with their fiduciary duties. Equally important, governments must raise public awareness of the SDGs and build capabilities to deliver on SDG investment. This includes engaging relevant partners to equip our people with the knowledge and skills needed. In this connection, Singapore is pleased to host the UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development, which has partnered our agencies to co-create innovative solutions for sustainable development in areas such as digital agriculture, smart cities, and sustainable finance. Second, monetary authorities will need to complement the government's efforts to develop the green finance solutions and markets. This may include the promotion of sustainable financing instruments, as well as the development of a common taxonomy on sustainable activities for financial institutions. MAS has been very active in these areas. More than 8 billion Singapore dollars in green, social, and sustainability bonds have been issued in Singapore since 2017 to provide the private sector with the incentives to embed sustainability considerations in their financing decisions. MAS also convened a Green Finance Industry Task Force to develop an industry taxonomy for Singapore-based financial institutions. MAS is actively participating in efforts to develop a regional taxonomy, taking into account international goals while tailoring it to ASEAN's context. MAS is setting out roadmaps for mandatory climate-related financial disclosures by financial institutions and listed entities, which will facilitate the comparison of climate-related investments. My colleague, Dr. Darian McBain, Chief Sustainability Officer from MAS, will shed more light on this. Lastly, the private sector is a crucial player. There are greater expectations from investors and consumers that companies incorporate ESG and channel resources towards sustainable business activities. These developments will drive SDG investments and should be scaled up. One example in Singapore is the Climate Impact X, a joint initiative by Temasek, DBS, SGX, and the Standard Chartered Bank to offer different financial products to cater to the needs of carbon credit buyers. This dovetails with Singapore's aspirations to become a thriving carbon marketplace and demonstrates our support for Asia's transition towards greater sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the impact of COVID-19, there are glimmers of hope. We have seen a shared sense of responsibility where governments, regulators, businesses, and individuals come together to tackle the challenges brought about by the pandemic. If we can bring the same spirit of togetherness in scaling up SDG-sensitive investments, there is hope that we can move closer towards achieving the SDGs by 2030. We look forward to supporting the UNDP's efforts to promote greater investments in the SDGs, including through the UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. Sustainable finance is already one of the center's key priorities, and it would be timely to explore how we can further expand our collaboration, bring others on board. I'm confident that this policy dialogue, its distinguished panel of speakers, and the esteemed panelists will provide valuable insights on how sustainable financing can be enhanced. I wish you all a fruitful discussion that will pave the way forward for concrete collaboration. Thank you all very much.
We would like to thank Dr. Balakrishnan for his opening remarks. Next up, it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Ms. Usha Rao Monari, Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Associate Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, to provide the keynote address.
Thank you very much, Hilda. Honorable Minister, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a true pleasure for me to be here in Singapore to welcome you to this policy dialogue. And on behalf of UNDP, I thank you all for joining us today at this event, which has been jointly organized by ourselves and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Where shall I start? The Honorable Minister was most clear in how he described the challenges facing us today. There are many, and a lot of them are centered on the need for the world and for all of us to be more sustainable and more resilient. You know, when I looked at my speech today, I decided to go off script, and here's why. Because I'm looking at the world and I'm saying to myself, we are truly at an extraordinary point of the world history. We're facing challenges, honestly, that even 3 years ago, we never thought we would face. I'm talking about the pandemic here. But it's not just that. It is the climate crisis. It's the biodiversity crisis. It's the social inequality and inclusion crisis. We're facing almost a perfect storm of crises, and we have to find our way through this in a productive, hopeful, and optimistic way. The trends are moving in a direction where if we don't correct them, we will find ourselves at a point where we will not be able to turn back the clock. The Honourable Minister spoke about climate. I was at COP26. We've all heard the story of the 1.5 number. But if we really don't take actions towards climate, biodiversity, people-planet balance, and social inclusion, we will find ourselves at a very difficult point. Having said that, though, I think that what is happening is that the sort of convergence of crises has led us to a new and more nuanced, if I may use that word, interrogation of what we have to do. It's no longer a situation of saying, let us look backwards in time, find examples, and use the same examples to move forward. No, we have to look at new enablers of change. We have to look at new enablers of progress in order to move forward. And there is optimism, I have to say. I am seeing, as I did at COP26, increased interest, not just on the part of traditional players such as governments and policymakers. I'm seeing interest on the part of the private sector, both the industrial private sector as well as the financial private sector, who wish to lean in and are asking the question, we are interested, how shall we work with everybody? I also see a different voice coming from civil society that's saying, we'd like to join you at the table and we'd like to put forward our point of view, but most importantly, we'd like to work with all of you. So what I am seeing from where I sit is a convergence between traditionally different groups and perhaps even opposing groups who didn't really come together. And for me, that really does give me optimism. So how do we deliver, right? All of yesterday and the day before, the question that I've been talking to my colleagues about is not so much the what or the why. I'm not going to spend any time on that. It's really the how. How do we do things differently? The examples that the Honourable Minister gave us are really inspiring. Singapore, I have to say, has provided a really interesting and inspiring way forward in how to look at sustainability and resilience. The Minister talked about the sustainability program. He spoke about the coordination between the Monetary Authority and the central banks in putting together a greening of the financial system initiative. He spoke about a number of other things that Singapore is doing to actually put muscle behind the how. And I think we can all take enormous example from Singapore's experience, initiative, and procedures that they're putting in place in order to go forward. From our perspective in UNDP, and we are looking at sustainability finance and sustainable finance, and it's called so many different things around the world, SDG-linked finance, ESG finance in the United States. Everybody's talking about it. Many, many people are trying to do something about it, but there's still a whole part of society that is still not leaning in, and I think at UNDP it is our sincere effort to try to pull as many people as possible into this. So what have we been doing from our side? We have 3 enablers, we think, which will take us to the next level as a planet and as a people. One, of course, is sustainable finance, and that's the subject of today's dialogue. But the 2 others are strategic innovation. I almost call it structural innovation, meaning it's innovation at every level of what we do. Innovation in governance, innovation in energy, innovation in anything that we're looking at. Number 2, it's digitalization, or the use of technology, both old sector-related technologies as well as newer technologies, whether it's blockchain, AI, IoT, using technologies to provide pathways that leapfrog traditional pathways. We were talking about that in one of the meetings we had yesterday. How do we use technology to do things slightly different and to accelerate our path forward? So UNDP has a sustainable finance hub where we've put forward a few things. Our SDG Impact is our flagship initiative. We're very proud of it. And the objective of the initiative is to accelerate investment towards sustainable development, quite simply put. And we're introducing a number of tools. I'll name a few of them. The first one is our SDG Impact Standards. Why are standards important in moving forward? Because today, there is a lot of, I must say, confusion around whether what we're doing is the right thing to do, whether what we're doing will really move the needle on sustainability and resilience. So what we did in UNDP was to put forward or put together a set of guidelines for private equity funds, and I see Blackstone sitting here, for enterprises and for bond issuers, all 3, that provide a clear framework for integrating impact into business and investment decision-making. What are the standards of that? And here I would like to make a very clear distinction between principles, which there's a proliferation of, I must say, around the world, and standards. Standards have muscle behind what we're saying, and we believe that the ones we've put forward which have been carefully thought through, peer-reviewed, are very interesting for others to use. The second is our investor platform. It's basically a platform or a database that provides investors with access to information and insights on concrete SDG-aligned investment opportunities. Because if I go back into my background is finance, and I say, okay, I get it, I want to do something, I've got my money, it's all ready, I've got your standards, I think I know what I should be doing, but where do I put my money? That, in many, many ways from my perspective, and on a relative basis, it's easier to put together pools of money and many times harder to deploy it into the right things. And that's why we have today constantly this notion of greenwashing and blue washing and God knows all kinds of colors of washing that money is being faced with. And I had an interview with BBC not so long ago, and they asked me about this, and I said, look, the fact that people are leaning in and doing the right thing is admirable. I think that's great. It's very different from what happened 5 years ago. Now they have to do it right. And so here is UNDP, at least, as one of the small players trying to help doing it right? So once we have an investment pipeline that looks at SDG-aligned investment opportunities, that gives the pools of money opportunities to deploy. And that's very, very important. And this is a global initiative. Of course, Asia-Pacific is a very, very important region for us, but it's a global initiative. We also have, as the Honourable Minister mentioned, our global centre that's actually providing thought leadership on various aspects. One of them is sustainable finance. We're looking at technology, we're looking at digitalization. It's a very interesting global center that provides, if you will, thought through methodologies, even taxonomies of how to go forward in the sustainability and resilience space. Here in Singapore, the Monetary Authority convened, as the Honourable Minister said, the Green Finance Industry Task Force. Very interesting. Their mandate is to produce a detailed implementation guide for climate-related disclosures by financial institutions and a framework to help banks assess eligible green trade financial transactions, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this so exciting? Because this shows an initiative on the part of government and policymakers to bring in the rest of the players to the cause and to finding a way forward through procedures, through implementation guides, etc., to move forward. The Monetary Authority also launched Project Greenprint, a technology-driven platform to help mobilize capital for green projects. And such initiatives have actually put muscle, if you will, behind words of we should do something and we need to do something to move forward. I think that what for me is exciting, I'm based in New York. I look around the New York sort of landscape. I see many institutions, financial and otherwise, who are coming to talk to us and saying, we'd like to do more in this space. How do we do it right? And what are the opportunities that we have? And it's not, by the way, just an emerging markets issue. Sustainable finance, green finance, etc., are a world issue. Developed and developing markets have to look at standards, have to look at ways forward so that we all come together in creating real change to move the needle. So where do I end up? I think I end up at the point where I'd like to conclude to say we are very engaged in this effort, not alone, because it cannot be alone. It's a whole of society approach that we'd like to encourage. We think that when we look at the investment market and sustainable investment market, we always think of what we call a 3I model. It has to be investment with impact, with integrity. And why is that the case? Because without the integrity aspect, then we are laid back to the position where we're accused of greenwashing and that we're not actually achieving the goals we've set out for ourselves. So if we all remember the 3I model as we go forward in these policy dialogues, and I'm looking so forward to the panelists and what they have in mind when it comes to sustainable investing, I think it would be a very interesting discussion to be had. I think to achieve the SDGs and put the world on a more sustainable and equitable pathway, we really need all hands on deck. It's not just the multilaterals, it's not just governments, it's not just policymakers, it is the private sector, it is the civil society that have to come together. I think that environmental and social sustainability should become the default setting for businesses. Yesterday, somebody said to me, we had some money as a business and therefore we had the space to look at sustainability. And I said to that individual, I'm very glad, but honestly, I'd like you to do it the other way around. I'd like you to say that our sustainability approach is making us money. So I'd like us all to keep in mind that sustainability is not necessarily just a non-return earning activity. Sustainability has to be in the DNA of our businesses, of our economy, of our policies. And I'd like to end with saying Singapore can be an example of how governments working with their monetary authorities can purposefully pursue the sustainable development agenda and drive acceleration and drive participation from what I guess are still non-traditional actors. I look forward very much to this conversation that's going to take place. Thank you all for your attention. Good morning to all of you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Usha Rao Manari, for your very heartfelt message on how we need to work together to tackle this colossal challenge. Next up, we would like to take a very short break, a 5-minute break, before we proceed with the panel discussion. I would like to invite all the speakers up on stage.
battery, they will turn on from that side. Yeah.
Yeah, they turned it on just so you can speak.
Yeah.
Got it.
All right.
Okay. Am I waiting for Hilda?
Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Assistant Administrator, United Nations Development Program, and Director, UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. In the panel with us, we have Dr. Darian McBain, Chief Sustainability Officer of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and we also have Mr. Alan Miyazaki, Senior Managing Director and Head of Real Estate Acquisition Asia for Blackstone Singapore. And finally, we have Mr. Joris Dirks, Regional Head of Southeast Asia for BNP Paribas. And over to you, Ms. Kani, to kick off the session.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all. And we have a large participation online, so I would like to welcome all our virtual audience as well as everyone in the room here. Let me just give everyone a little more on our panelists so that you know where they come from, and then they can, if I don't hit it all right, they can share little tidbits about themselves as well. So Darian, as I just learned, is very recent to Singapore and is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And for those of us who don't use those terms, we know this as central banks in our region. Darian, before coming here, has more than 20 years' experience in various sustainability roles that covered a number of sectors. And she will be drawing on all of that, but we really are keen to get her perspective from the Monetary Authority. There are many who have worked in and supported central banks across our region who are listening in. And before this, she was the Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability in the Thai was it the Union Group, right? Yes. She was named a UN SDG pioneer for sustainable ocean economy. So welcome, Darian. Then we have Alan. Alan Miyazaki is the head of real estate acquisitions for Asia at the Blackstone Singapore Group. And you know this as a private equity fund. You know this as a big investor, doing lots of mergers and acquisitions, and well-known, a very long history also in real estate. And Alan is really focused on the real estate acquisitions at Blackstone. Now, before Blackstone, Alan was with Starwood Capital Group, where he worked also in the area of acquisitions. And then we have Joris. And Joris is the head of corporate and institutional banking for Southeast Asia and CEO of the Singapore branch of BNP Paribas. Now, that's a big international bank. So you can see we've got three different but connected perspectives that we've tried to bring to this panel. And before this, he was at the General Bank in Belgium and then at Fortis, with playing various roles in project finance and export finance in Brussels, Dublin, Mumbai, and now, and this is his second round in Singapore. Before joining BNP Paribas here in 2010, Joris was country head in Greece, ROK or South Korea, and India. So an amazing panel. And I'm going to kick it off with a question to each of them. And then I'm going to ask some of my colleagues to look at the comments, questions, issues coming in from our virtual audience as well, but also from the room. And I will take questions from any of you to our esteemed panel. So Darian, maybe let me start with you. And we've seen, and particularly in Singapore and in this part of the world, the huge role that financial markets are playing to reallocate capital. And of course, for us, we are, as Usha said in her opening remarks, very biased to seeing the transition to capital following a low carbon economy, but also equity and justice in that. And this is beyond just individual countries. We like to see this across different sectors, companies, and the region. So from where you sit at the Monetary Authority, how does a government strategically orchestrate this capital shift? And what instruments do you feel have been effective and successful to do so?
Thank you, Kenny, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I was very fortunate that the Honourable Minister and Undersecretary have already mentioned some of the initiatives of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And I think in Singapore, we're very fortunate that the MAS has multiple functions that it can play. And so, yes, it is the central bank, but it's also the financial regulator, and it helps to develop the financial markets. And so when you look across all of those three functions, and we start to look at the challenges of something as broad and vast as how do we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, or how can we achieve climate financing, you actually need to pull on all of those levers that we have. And so MAS has what's called the Green Finance Action Plan, which is going across all of these different areas. So one area is looking at environmental regulations and environmental risk management. And the reason for this is to make sure that the financial sector is robust and resilient to the future shocks that may come in the climate change. And so through environmental risk management guidelines, for example, and setting out the expectations that we have of financial institutions, we can make sure that through the likes of stress testing, that they are ready and prepared for the potential future shocks. Another area that we work in is looking at the financial tools and how the markets can develop. I think the Honourable Minister mentioned about sustainability bonds, sustainability-linked loans, green bonds, social bonds. How can we make sure that environment is built up and so that money can be funneled into these sectors in a way that's understandable and can really have impact? And I'll come back to that point about impact because I think that's something we need to keep a strong focus on. It's one thing to have money going into these tools, it's another thing to have impact on the ground. Next, we look at how do we harness the power of technology? And again, Project Greenprint was mentioned. And that's looking at, we have this technological environment, all sorts of things now rely on technology. But how can we get ESG data, for example, using technology? How can we gather information on the ground and bring it in so that the financial institutions can be making their decisions based on real and timely data? How do we verify that information? How do we understand it? And how can we bring it together so that you can look at not just across different portfolios, but also have a temporal perspective? How are things changing over time? And so that's where we see that technology has a very important part to play. Another area is building capacity and capabilities. So we know that jobs are going to be changing. We know that the future is going to look different. How do we make sure that people have the capacity to do the new jobs in the future that we're expecting? I mean, I talk about this as the green revolution. You know, we are going to have fundamentally different industries. People will be working in different areas. And so particularly from the financial perspective, the Monetary Authority of Singapore looks at how we build those capabilities and capacities. So recently, for example, we released the training and skills competencies for sustainable finance. So that's setting out the criteria that we think that people should be learning and being trained to make them future ready for the sustainable finance. And lastly, we have data and disclosures. So mentioned were taxonomies. Taxonomies are very important in that it helps give that signal of where the money should be going, how it should flow. We've mentioned the ASEAN taxonomy. Singapore, through the Green Finance Industry Task Force, has an industry-led taxonomy. Obviously, we're looking at the likes of the European taxonomy and China's taxonomy to make sure that, one, it's interoperable. And so the large organizations, like we have here in the panel represented, can work across multiple jurisdictions, but also so that there can be a green light to say, this is the area that we should be financing. Because if we're looking at $150 trillion going into climate financing, this region alone, we're looking at by 2030, $2 to $3 trillion of financing required. We actually need to move with speed. And so having the taxonomies, data, and disclosures are all very important. And I think I just lastly mention making sure that we network around the world. It's very important that Singapore has this vibrant green ecosystem. But actually, climate change is not a one-country issue. It's, of course, across all different jurisdictions. And so there is an organization called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which was mentioned. That has many central banks around the world. In fact, over 70% of the world's GDP is covered by the members of the NGFS. And Mr. Ravi Menon, who is the managing director of Monetary Authority of Singapore, has just been named as the chairman of the NGFS. And I think this is a great opportunity for Singapore, but particularly for this region, to make sure that we are an integral part of the international discussions taking place on sustainable finance.
Thank you, Darian. I think, for all of us listening in, that sounds like a very progressive agenda for a central bank. And I'm not sure that all central banks cover the range of the levers that you called it in the kind of almost very positively activist way that the Monetary Authority of Singapore does. So much to learn from there, and I'm sure we're going to pick up some of these issues going forward. So I'm going to shift now to Alan and get a Blackstone perspective on Alan, listening to this, we know this can't be done without corporate leaders moving forward, right? And saying, I'm going to maybe go against the grain. And we need leadership in different sectors from the corporate world to make that shift. And again, as you heard in the opening remarks, both from the foreign minister and from Usha, if this is done well, it's both sustainable and it makes money. So give us your perspective on what you think both companies can do to lower their own carbon footprint, but then also what's different or special about Blackstone as a leader, an investment industry leader in trying to make this pivot.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'll start with just a little of the history. So I think that if you look at Blackstone, we've probably invested rough justice about $17 billion in the last 2 years in various initiatives for sustainability. So that could be everything from power management, solar. Actually, one of my favorites is we've actually invested in an underground cable that goes from Canada to New York City that basically takes hydroelectric power from Quebec Hydro. So basically dams on the Hudson Bay all the way down to New York City. And I would say that I'd love to tell you that that was something we did in the last year, but the reality is that took about a decade and a half to actually get done. So I think we've been able to identify issues that have been out there for a long time and tried to find creative solutions to some of those issues. So that's an example of something that's been in the works for a long time. It's probably longer than most of our investments at Blackstone, but it obviously really hit a need in terms of clean power going to New York City. Also, I would say, when you look at some of the stuff, I do a lot of the real estate stuff. So, we've been doing things like building solar parks in India. And honestly, that started, it was great that it was green, but it also started because the grid in India is not wonderful. So having solid power for your tenants is actually a very important thing. And so it's not only is it green and a good thing for the environment, it's actually a good business practice too, because it's also good for our tenants and the people that are in our business parks. So I think that there was there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of opportunities where you could do things that were great for the planet, but also great economically and also for all your stakeholders. I think one of the big challenges, especially as a group that invests, we have some funds that are long life, open-ended funds, But a lot of our business, we buy things that hold it for 3 to 5 years. And so, one of the things that we've done and we've committed to is during the first 3 years, actually decreasing the carbon footprint by 15%. And part of the challenge is, if you're a company that owns things forever, you can go and do a net zero policy or something like that. But the reality is, for us, we're not going to own these assets for the next 20 years. So how do we make an impact today that will be sustainable in the future? So the first thing we've had to do is really start, and I think Darren was saying this earlier, you've really got to look at measurements. So how do you measure what you have? And so we partnered with Schneider Electric to really do every asset that we buy to onboard and be able to measure what's actually happening to the assets. We used to call it like the late night walk. So, if you ever happen to be up at 3 in the morning, walk around your house, walk around your apartment, and see what's on. See what's pulling power, and you'd be surprised. And if you do that with an office building, you'd be even more surprised. So what we found is, doing little things like that, that was kind of the first thing we did. And that was a very, smart thing to do, but also a very economic thing to do. And now we've gone and taken it up to really monitoring everything. And that gives you a baseline to monitor and to really check and see where you give yourself a scorecard and see where you can actually make a change. And during that 3-year period, the goal is to actually set up, monitor, go proactively make changes so you can actually make a difference. And then when you sell it to the next buyer, those changes don't reverse. So you've actually made a real step in the right direction. For things that we're going to own for a longer period of time in our open-ended funds, then we have a longer runway, what we can actually achieve. But I think that that's a decent measurement, because if you want to judge what somebody's going to do in 20 years, the number of assets will turn over 3 or 4 times. And so making an impact today that will be sustainable and passed on to the next owner, we think is pretty important.
Could I just push you a little bit on that, Alan? So from what you're saying, because, you don't want a decade and a half, right? It can't take a decade and a half for a number of these things. At the same time, you've got to own the asset for long enough to make the changes. Is that changing Blackstone's business model fundamentally?
I think it just means we've got to hurry up, to be honest with you. I mean, if you look at least in our opportunistic funds, we have this mantra called buy it, fix it, sell it. And historically, the fix it has been, spend some capital to renovate the property or renew a lease or tenant up a vacant building. But increasingly, that's not the only fix it. So the other part of the fix it can be, okay, let's look at the carbon footprint. Let's look at the, the power savings, because all those things do drop to the bottom line. I mean, we're big owners in Japan. So for example, we're in the process of taking all of our residential portfolios. So we probably own 15,000, 16,000 units across Japan, and going through in each of those properties, making it so we're using renewable power. And then also making that an option for each of our tenants so they can be using renewable power in their unit as opposed to non-renewable power. So I think that that's something that wasn't available to them previously. So if we can make that change, and people, for them, for an individual apartment, it's not that big a cost. A lot of people will go and go with that option. So we think that those are the types of things that are really important. And once people go and make that switch, they don't tend to go back.
Right. No, thank you. Joris, I'm going to turn to you and get the perspective of a big international bank. And so while Alan's doing his nighttime walk, I want you to do a daytime walk around the economy here and say, what does BNP Paribas see in terms of those big levers that actually can shift? So again, it comes back to what a monetary authority is doing, right? Do you see that from where you sit? What really would be some of the effective ways to raise serious capital behind sustainability initiatives that otherwise, if you can't take this to scale, a lot of pretty little things aren't going to make the difference? Over to you.
Yes, but so from a banking perspective, it's really what Darian was already alluding to. It's how capital gets allocated and how is that done in an efficient manner. And there's the whole basic principle of the internalizing the externalities and correcting market imperfections. So for that, we really need a policy, a very active policy. You also mentioned taxonomy. A bank like BNP Paribas or an investment firm like Blackstone, we operate globally, so we need to have standards that are applicable everywhere and comparable. And I think I guess we'll talk about it more later, because there's really still a lot to be done to kind of establish the baseline, to measure impact. How does that get recognized, and how is that then ultimately get used to allocate capital? And so there, government policies, central banking policies play a very, very determining role to really steer that capital allocation. Also about disclosures, there was the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. There is now a similar task force set up to do with disclosure of nature-related financial risks that banks, but also the clients of banks, are exposed to, and that then all helps to develop stress testing and to look at the credit portfolio, the investment portfolio of banks, financial institutions, and see where the risks are exposed. And that is all a process that's still sort of in an initial phase. So at BNP Paribas, only from last year onwards, we've really integrated ESG, for example, in our credit process. When we go to a credit committee where we make and invest a decision whether or not to grant a loan or to finance a company, a corporate, to really take into account ESG criteria and exposures to potential risks, which can be short term, but as we also mentioned, it's usually more medium to long term. How do we look at that, and how do we remain competitive in an environment where those applications are not yet universal across the market? And I think there a lot of policy support is still required, and the network for greening the financial system is making progress there. But ultimately what from the banking sector, for example, we're still waiting for is what will be the impact on capital allocations that we do on, for example, our credit portfolio. Will there be a positive for green or sustainable or ESG related credits, or is there going to be a penalty for more brown industries that we finance and that we provide financial services to? So we really still need, I think, stronger policy guidance on how that is done. The challenge being it needs to be global. There needs to be an alignment between the different jurisdictions, because otherwise we're going to get displacement of capital. Another element that I think we're still waiting to see how it evolves is the dichotomy between public and private markets. So a lot of investment is shifting away from public markets into private assets, private equity, private debt. And that by definition is subject to less public scrutiny. Banks like BNP Paribas, large firms, are always subject to that public scrutiny through different stakeholders in civil society. Smaller investors, smaller operators can not escape, but can avoid that. And again, there may be capital incentives that are not fully aligned, and so I think it's important that policymakers keep an eye on that, and again provide guidance to channel capital. Next step then is really, and Darian has already mentioned a lot about that, because MAS is very active in creating a marketplace in Singapore. The example that all of us know is green bonds. So green bonds are the market for green bonds and green bonds, ESG bonds, SDG bonds. So all ESG related bonds that have ESG related criteria embedded in their structure are growing exponentially. And so there is a market that is there, that has liquidity. I don't want to go into the technical details, but the pricing difference is still insufficient. It's a market mechanism that has started to evolve, but it needs to strengthen, but it will happen. And that's been done because there are a number of frameworks that have been put in place. I would say, started by initiatives in the private sector, the green bond principles, but that was then taken on by regulators such as MAS and others to create frameworks for green bond issuances that make the market very transparent and that provide a lot of liquidity to that market. And so what we really need is again, more of that is kind of underpinning of market framework and infrastructure by regulators, by central banks. And again, MAS has done a lot. We've been involved with them very specifically for us, for example, for sustainable supply chain financing, which is one product. Other banks worked on sustainability-linked loans. So the different type of financing instruments that banks can provide need their own framework, so that we're all working off the same standards, and that we're doing comparable. The danger being, of course, and then we're back to the taxonomy discussion, it gives a huge impetus to where capital is going, and so small changes can have big impact. So it's really a balancing act of doing what is possible and foreseeing potential evolutions. And then a third aspect, I think, is creating of capability, is really training. So at BNP Paribas, we invest a lot in informing and training our staff on ESG related topics, and it's very broad, from explaining what are the SDGs to everybody to really going in very detailed about mobility, urban environment, etc. Low carbon transition, how do we look at that with our clients? How can we support our clients? How do our clients adjust their strategy into transition to a low carbon economy? And so training, disseminating of information and training is important. And again, their public policy can provide a strong incentive. In Singapore, it's done through the IBF. MAS was also instrumental in setting up the Singapore Green Financing Center, which is a collaboration between SMU, Imperial College, but supported by 9 financial institutions, founding partners. So again, collaboration, but also policy setting to encourage capability building.
Thank you, Joris. There's a lot there, and I'd like us to unpack some of this going forward, including, are we investing in more green or less brown? I mean, it's showing in the marketplace there is a shift there, and particularly in a number of countries in our region. That's a big political decision, let alone a policy decision, but also who escapes the regulators. And is our taxonomy and our standards, all-encompassing to really make sure this happens. But let me turn to the room and see if there's anyone in the room who'd like to throw a question to any of our panelists. Anyone would like to? We have a number of questions coming in also virtually, but I just want to take a quick look in the room. Ashok, can I turn to you? Do you have a mic with you?
That's okay. I've been loud enough. No, the online. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, why don't you take this?
May I?
Yeah, please.
More, first of all, this is good, and I'm glad that there is a certain diversity in the kind of representation. We're all seeking separately, but finding together. That's probably the wonder of this wisdom. But more specifically to the banks, because this is something that you have, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you feel from your remarks that you feel more scrutinized because of your size, and therefore that probably sets you back a little bit from being as green as you'd like to be if the same taxonomy does not apply to the less scrutinized institutions. I'm just listening to that part alone, so obviously I'm taking a piece that might appear out of context, but as an operating business that deals with bankers, and we are the beneficiaries of that, or financial institutions like equity, there's very little discussion that genuinely happens about green initiatives. I'm talking from a business perspective. And we don't see these discussions emanating. It's more in the newspapers. It's not in the direct relationships. So I'm wondering whether there is anything there that, that's giving you guys have a strategy that separates it by saying that it is not our job to follow sustainable practices only when they make business sense. Can banks make business sense out of sustainable practices? Is there that transition? It's a long question, though.
That's for me, I guess. No, I think absolutely for banks, sustainability and ESG in general now is one of the guiding principles along which we run our business. So for BNP Paribas in particular, about 5 years ago, the SDGs were incorporated in kind of the vision statement that we have for the firm. And so the strategy that our top management is applying is we don't have a sustainable finance department. We have centers of competence, centers of excellence where the knowledge is gathered and it's disseminated. But we're really looking at mainstreaming sustainability and ESG across all our businesses. I think where the difficulty still, or where the challenge is, so we run our own business. So scope 1 and 2, I think it's fairly clear. There are clear net zero targets, and most of them we have achieved ahead of time that we set through managing the buildings, through managing green energy supplies and offsetting carbon offsetting where to complement that. So the real challenge is in scope 3, right? It's how when we look at our credit portfolio where we finance the real economy, and that goes from our retail clients having home loans to large corporates having big investment projects. How do we balance that, and how do we implement a low carbon strategy across the board? And then we come to the issue where it's most difficult. We could say, we will move away from industry and finance only renewable energy. But that does not help. I mean, it doesn't. It's not a possible choice for all banks in the entire world. So if we want to look at a model for banking that contributes towards a net zero carbon, we need to go step by step. And obviously financing renewable energy is a big part of that. But we also need to see how do we transition from in hard to abate sectors, for example, how do we set goals, targets, and we go back to taxonomy, measuring, etc., capital allocation. How do we set those goals and targets, and how do we get there at BNP Paribas as an individual bank, but also across the sector? So very concretely in the energy, BNP Paribas has created a low carbon transition group. So it's a group of 250 specialists across the world. Again, about 2/3 of them are already there and are converting towards that strategy to mainstream the sustainability strategy in kind of the BAU business of the bank. Others, of course, we need to hire different people with different skill sets to get to that. And there we have very concrete targets on decarbonizing our investment portfolio to kind of contribute to that transition to a low carbon economy.
Let me maybe, Alan, while I want to get your perspective on a simulation, I'm going to link it to a question coming in from one of our listeners. If you picked a traditional sector and said, here's something we would be doing now that we wouldn't have done a couple of years ago because of all of what we've been talking about, give us an example of where the sustainability issue has really gotten anchored into significant choices and decisions that you are taking.
I think we've been doing a lot of this over the years, but we've done it very piecemeal. So it was we were looking at energy saving stuff in hotels early days, and then looked at it in places with high utility costs like Japan. And I think that the difference was you were doing it on a one-off basis. And what we transitioned to is rather than doing it one-off, doing it systemically across the portfolio. So whenever we buy something, we do actually look at ESG as one of the components to what we're buying, and look at what the opportunity there to make adjustments and changes within that asset. And that's part of our business plan. So if you actually went and read one of our risk committee books, there's actually a section on what we're doing from a sustainability practice in that asset or in that company. And that's in your cash flows. And then when you go to your quarterly asset reviews or your quarterly board meetings, there's a section where we sit there and say, okay, just like we were focused on what were the rents and what are we doing with releasing, there's a section that goes, okay, what do we think we'd be able to do from an ESG perspective, cutting carbon emissions, and how does that affect our financials? That's also a piece of it. So I think that and going to your original question, I think there are two things here. One, in terms of the financial opportunity, and George was talking about this earlier, I do think that we actually have in our credit business a business that just invests in green financing. So we're starting that. I think that will be a growing sector over time. We obviously want to be at the forefront of that. And then I think even within our real estate portfolio, we're doing green financing. We've done more in Europe than we've done in Asia. We did actually own a building called Eclipse in One North here in Singapore that we did a green financing on. It closed earlier this week. And I think that if you look at the financial results for that and the spreads in terms of the cost, it's not that big a difference from a normal financing today. There's a little bit of savings, but it's not much. But I think that you're going to see over time that will change. And I think that gap will widen, and there will be a premium for having green versus non-green financing. And I think, as an example, the fact that we're raising dedicated capital for that will create a supply-demand imbalance, which will result in a better arbitrage there, and that will further encourage more people to be more proactive. So, maybe we're at the bigger end of the scale in terms of the size of our company, what we do, but if you're a smaller player, an individual, you're a family, and you can sit there and say, look, I can finance at X, but if I do these things to improve my building, I can finance at Y and actually achieve some savings. That's an extra impetus or a catalyst for them to make those changes. I think that'll come as well. It'll just be a process of, as that market gets larger, as that market matures, you'll see that opportunity. I think that's will be a great opportunity for people that are commercial and are investors like ourselves, and we want to be on the forefront of that. But I think also just in terms of actually having a lot of these things enacted in these properties and in these businesses around the world.
Thank you. And I think for a lot of our listeners, one of the concerns they have, because they're constantly talking to policy leaders, both in public and private sector, is how do you shorten this transition period? Because this, is going to be, if this doesn't accelerate, there's no way we can get to the 1.5, right? I mean, there has to be a much faster rate. And so I'm going to come back to you, Darian, on this. Where do you see some of the biggest holdouts? Where are some of the big challenges where a regulator, then even an activist regulator, is thinking, my goodness, this can't take a decade. We've got to do something now.
I think the pace of change, as you said, is a challenge. While we're working out the taxonomies, how do we speak this language that can go across multiple countries? What could green be? I mean, we had Larry Fink say that, the next 1,000 unicorns, are going to be in green tech, green solutions. The International Energy Agency has said that most of the technology that we need to get to net zero by 2050 isn't actually investable as yet. And so how do you design a taxonomy based on technology that doesn't exist, when we don't really know the direction. So then I think you need to go back to a scientific base, science-based targets. How will you get on that trajectory? How can you look at the energy intensity of activities? And that's certainly what we're hearing from financial institutions, that looking at the transition pathways towards 1.5 degrees C is a very important way, and that can be happening now. And indeed, it is happening now. I think one of the other challenges is just the scale of the market and how do we bring everyone together. And one of those opportunities is in blended finance. So I can see from one of the questions that came up, why is it not the public sector doing this? Why is it not the private sector? I think we need to look at it from a holistic point of view of why is it not everybody putting this in? You can have the governments, you can have the development banks, you can have private sector, you are going to have the private offices. I mean, they are really providing some catalytic funds to all of these. You've got some innovative platforms coming up. So here in Singapore, Temasek and HSBC created a sustainable financing debt platform where they can bank marginally bankable infrastructure projects throughout Southeast Asia to really get this needle to move. Because although we talk about the exponential growth rate in sustainable bonds, green bonds, social bonds, they're still only worth around 1.26% of the market. To get up to, let's say, 6 trillion, I think that would be 5%. We might get there by 2025, but we need to move that needle much faster. And so anything where I think we can make faster, more effective decisions based on real data that has an impact, linking it back to climate change, linking it back to warming and 1.5 degrees C, I think that's when we're going to start to see some real change. But going also back to the theme of this conference, it can't only be that, because if we ignore the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals, then we could be creating even more challenges for ourselves down the future.
That's a very good point. And again, to pick up a question here, as you said, we're still, although we saw the trend is on the rise, right? 2020 to 2021, you're seeing more than a tripling of investments, ESG-related investments, but it's a drop. It's a drop in the ocean. So the ability to kind of move this much faster forward will also come with seeing a business model that says there is profitability in this. This is not just it's good for everyone, right? I mean, that's a big issue there that I think we've got to be able to crack that fast. So I'm going to also come back to the three of you to say where in industry or in a sector are you seeing some trendsetters that are really taking this to scale. Alan, quickly to you, and then I'll go to Niloy for a question.
Yeah, one question on that. We talked about, is it investable? I think one of the other things you've got to look for is you don't want to be left behind here. So if you're the only building on the block that's old and not green, nobody's going to want to lease your space. So I think if you I'm going to look at Australia as a good example. They were very focused on having all government offices in higher rated, LEED, gold LEED buildings, and that actually changed the market a little bit because all of a sudden, if you wanted to lease, have government credit in your building, you had to reach higher standards. You had to be a more green building, and that makes a difference. That was a way of leading and pushing the market, and then other people followed quickly. And so all of a sudden, those are the standards that became the norm, not the exception.
No, that's a very good point. Niloy, over to you. I think you can also go to the. If you prefer this.
Actually, Dr. had a follow-up question. No, please go ahead. No, thank you. This is a follow-up question more because Darren, you said something that was striking about the timing and the urgency, because time is a big challenge, and you also kind of asked Alan the question about what is an example of some of the new ways or innovative ways. And we were having yesterday a conversation with the same delegation on precision agriculture, democratizing it, improving livelihood, releasing land, and then finding alternative uses for land. So this is a convergence question. How a monetary authority or a regulator can lean in with, for example, Blackstone. if you have these large real estate investments and you link that to the Singapore government's bold 30 by 30 program, which is food security 30 by 30, 30% of food being produced in Singapore by 2030, that's a very powerful nutritional and food security vision. The role that therefore means urban agriculture, because that's what Singapore is. It also means rooftop agriculture. It also means real estate being shifted from the farms to producing within buildings. And therefore, there is a regulatory piece right there in terms of categorizing some of these real estate as farmlands, incentivizing businesses to work within, to create urban farming, precision farming, high precision farming. And it won't be just 30 by 30. Then that can really skyrocket and address the issue, Darian, about timing. This can be done quickly. We're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 years, not 25, 30 years. Just a thought in terms of how this can converge
Come
together.
back to this if you hold, because that's a key issue, and this is why we're saying where are the trendsetters? Where are you seeing the winners that will pull the rest forward?
A very simple question. Thank you, Kani and panelists. A very simple question. What's the conversation in your boardrooms, in all three of your respective boardrooms, in this sort of green is more expensive, there's a green premium, and business as usual is where the big bucks are. And then what is the conversation in your children's bedroom that you are having with your children?
Okay.
Who's on the board?
Both this. Joris, you want to go?
Sure. Well, I'm not on the board, and my children are teenagers, so I'm no longer allowed in their bedroom.
Very good answer.
But I'll make a guess of both. So as I said at BNP Paribas, and I think it's true for a number of financial institutions, ESG is no longer an optionality. It's core to what we do, and the strategy of the firm going forward embeds that into the core of the vision and where we want to go. I don't want to go into a long pitch about BNP Paribas, but when we just announced 2-3 weeks ago to the market kind of our 2025 plan, and that's GST, which is growth, technology, sustainability. So sustainability really is one of the three of the key pillars of our strategy or action plan towards 2025. And the view is not green is more expensive. The view is green is profitable, and green is what we want to contribute as a responsible corporate citizen. This is what we want to do. This is where we want to go. And as I said, we have very clear targets on decarbonizing our portfolio, etc. And it's not so much about some choices are negative. We have exited the tobacco sector. We have exited like a lot of international banks, but probably we did it a bit earlier. We exited financing of coal-fired power plants. Corporates that rely too much on that. So those are clear choices that have been made. The more challenging bit is how do we incorporate the transition strategy into the bank strategy, and how do we contribute to setting targets for a low carbon economy, and how do we finance the transition to that. And I think that's where balance still needs to be found, and I think that's where there's a very important role for public policy and regulators to kind of provide the right incentives.
Good segue to you, Darian, to pick up both these issues, but also I see, Singapore MAS just announced a large issuance that they're going to go into on green bonds. And you can see one of our participants has asked about green bond issuance going up to 250 billion this year. But the real question there is, what is it exactly behind, and the impact measures? At the end of the day, what value are we saying to investors, this is what you're getting for it? But over to you.
So going to the board question, and I am also not on the board, so I can't say actually what those discussions are. But I think if you look at the role of a central bank, It is to create a sustainable and stable economy. And sustainable in that sense has often been used as a temporal perspective, and I mentioned this before. But we can't have the economy in isolation. It has to be with people and the environment. When you start to look at the three capitals, you know, you've got your natural capital. We need that. We need to have financial capital, and we need the human capital. And so I think the discussion is not so much, do we have a portion of green? Do we have some focus? It is, how do we make sure we can make this transition to a sustainable future or to a green future and have it in an orderly and just way so that people aren't left behind. We still have natural resources. We can still have the benefits that the environment provides, and we have a stable and fully functioning economy. And so I think it is actually less of a challenge from a central bank perspective, because it really is fundamental to why you have central banks providing this stable, long-term, sustainable future. So I would say that is part of the discussion, and it's about it not being green is something that we're doing now because that seems like a fun thing, and we've got 2030 coming up. Most central banks are taking a much longer term perspective than 2030.
Alan, I'm going to Ashok's follow-up question, but also a very good one here, that at the end of the day, if you look at the data today, one of our participants has correctly pointed out that very little investment is going to climate adaptation. We're still sticking with the safety of mitigation. Over to you.
So a couple things on your question. What's the focus in the boardroom? I think increasingly, when we underwrite everything, this is a piece of the underwriting. So if you look at all the individuals and their performance objectives and their KPIs, this is part of it. Because just like the performance of your investments and how you invest, this is a piece of that. And I look at it in two ways. There's kind of offense and defense as an investor. The offense is, are there cost-saving opportunities? Can you make your property run more efficiently? And that's actually, and fortunately or unfortunately, because especially in Asia, it hasn't rolled out quite as much. There is a lot of low-hanging fruit still. So there are a lot of things that have really high return on equity and really high return on yield. So those are easy. But I think the defense part is actually equally important. And the reason why it's important is, I think if you look at if you're going to, as an investor, you have to sell your investment at some point in time. And what you're seeing with capital flows, you're seeing it in Australia, you're seeing it in Europe, is that capital wants to see that they're buying properties that meet certain criteria. And if you don't meet that criteria, that capital is not going to flow to your asset. So I think you'll see over time a bit of a bifurcation. So if you're on the good side, you'll have a lot of money that wants to invest with you. If you're not in that good side, it becomes much tougher. And that will result in difference in pricing. So when I say defense, if you want to make sure your property is high quality and stays on that good side, you have to invest in that property to make sure it meets that criteria. So just like the Australian government saying, I only want to be in these high quality sustainable buildings, the same thing is going to happen with other buildings too, not just from a tenant perspective, but also for a capital that's willing to go invest in them. So I think that that's why I think it's both offense and defense, so you have to be very aware of it. When you look at what we do in our boardrooms, I don't think we necessarily look at separately and say this is the offense column, this is the defense column, but the reality is all these different initiatives go play into that, because otherwise you're going to be left out in the cold, and that's not going to be a very good experience. So I think that's important. And also to the question about how do you elicit change in terms of if it's farming, in urban environments, other things. We put solar panels on top of all of our apartment complexes in Stuytown in New York. How do you do that? Some of that we did because we thought it was the right thing to do, but on a broader scale, how do you do it? And I think, at least my opinion is, it's no dissimilar than how do you do affordable housing. When you look at the zoning or you look at what the government will allow you to build, you say, gee, you can actually build X number more apartments, but if you do that, you have to have 10% or 20% affordable housing. So if you look at it from a zoning perspective, say, hey, you want to build a new building, that's great, but to do so, you have to add this component to that building. The nice thing about Singapore is, for the most part, the government owns all the land, so it's easier to control. In other jurisdictions, it's probably more through zoning and how they allocate what you can build. But I think if you go and put those together, there is an opportunity there and say, hey, if you want to build a bigger property, you want to be a mixed-use property, you have to add this component to your building, otherwise you won't get approved.
Could I also, there are a couple of questions coming in on what would be optimal financing instruments for the SDG agenda. And I'm sure this varies depending on sector and what asset and asset class you're talking about. But there's, seems to be an overemphasis on bond issuance. But are you, maybe Darian, I'll start with you. Are you seeing other financial instruments that may be making a bigger dent or a scalable or a good blend coming through?
So I think the bonds, as Joris said, the frameworks have been around for 10 years. And so to an extent, it's set out a way forward, and it's got a structure to it that you can follow. You've got the sustainability linked loans. There are other new tools that are coming about. And I think it's where the innovation comes in, and we heard about innovation before. I think blended finance is one of those areas where we're going to see more tools. How can we accelerate the investment into sustainable infrastructure, but also other sectors? And I think it's worth pointing that out, particularly when you look across all of the SDGs. I mean, I come from an ocean economy background, and SDG 14, which is life below water, remains the least funded of the SDGs. And yet the oceans help regulate the Earth's temperature. They are going to be one of the largest carbon sinks. They are potentially a market for carbon offsets and biodiversity. And so how can we now develop tools that make sure that we look at these new areas that we need to engage on? And I think that's an area of innovation that we aren't even there yet. At the moment, we are still mainly talking about green. We're mainly talking about environmental. What are the governance issues that we need to start looking at? It's not to say it can't be fit within the frameworks we have now. What are the social issues that we need to look at? Because as we talk about a just transition, we genuinely need that. Joris mentioned, and Alan also, stranded assets. If you consider the embodied energy in these big infrastructure projects, we can't just leave them abandoned. How is that going to add some value to society in the future? And so I actually think, we need more innovation and to think more broadly from that sustainability perspective, rather than at the moment we have a good focus on energy transition and perhaps the transport sector and building, but how do we get it into food and farming? How do we get it into manufacturing? And how do we really scale that in a way that has the meaningful impact? And I would still go back to what are the tools that can be developed that show that finance is going in such a way that it has an impact, and that you can add all of those impacts together to look cumulatively, is it going towards 1.5 degrees C?
And I think certainly for UNDP, that's the type of metrics where front loading is the impact measurement. Because you've got the financial measurements, we got to bring that in with, and so what? And for us, the importance of that is because money doesn't always flow immediately to where we would see there's high value from a human development or a human progress point of view. And so I think that's a key area of negotiation, if I might call it that, with the finance sector to make the case. And you're very right, oceans is still not getting the funding it should, the investments there. I mean, we're not dumping money in there, we're dumping plastic waste. So it really is a huge issue. You mentioned the carbon market, and this is still very underdeveloped in most countries. Don't want to get into it. Singapore's kind of moving forward there. But any views on that? And then I'd like to come back to the room to see if there's any questions from colleagues here. Joris?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the carbon market, I think there's an acceleration in the development there. So there are a number of carbon exchanges that exist. One of them is being set up by Temasek, DBS, SGX, and yes, the Carbon Impact X. There are air carbon. There are other carbon exchanges. There are also marketplaces for carbon. And I think what we see there, and then there's the formal carbon markets. You have the EU ETS, the US, I believe, is in 2025 will have its market. We're all very keenly waiting to see what will come out of China. So, and in addition, there is a voluntary market that's developing. Companies that set carbon reduction targets that if it cannot be achieved mostly for technical reasons, if there's kind of a bottom there that cannot be breached, there's voluntary offset. So there is clearly a marketplace coming back, because there was one under the Kyoto Treaty, so that is now coming back. Hopefully, again, because it's done public sector, private sector, blended, hopefully it will be more liquid and address more needs than is the case in something that's done purely from a regulatory perspective. But the discussions that we have there very often also is about quality. It's the assurance, especially in the voluntary markets. When we talk to our clients about that, they want to have assurance about the quality. So it's again going back to data collection, measurement, methodology, taxonomy. How does all that work together? And I think that's still a key issue that continues to evolve.
Darian, you want to come in on this?
I'll just briefly mention, so we had the budget statement here in Singapore last Friday, and the Minister of Finance announced a number of different measures. Some of them were around increasing the carbon tax here in Singapore, which I think is a very important measure. But just going on to the carbon markets, there was the announcement that businesses will be able to use high-quality international carbon credits to offset up to 5% of their taxable emissions. And I think this is a very interesting way that you can have governments working with the private sector and the international carbon market, because if you are able to offset it through a government program, but you're getting actually the carbon offsets will be coming from the private market, and that they have to be credible and that they will probably be formed on some kind of exchange. I think that is where you've got government helping to incentivize the private sector, and it can help to scale that market more quickly.
Let me switch to this issue of capabilities and investing in capabilities. And all three of you mentioned this. And for us, certainly for UNDP, this is a huge area, and the demand is growing and in the countries we're working in. So I want a cheat sheet. What are each of you doing? If you said this is what we're investing in terms of capacity building, where are you seeing what are you doing, and where are you seeing some change happening? Maybe Alan, first to you.
In terms of capacity, you mean in terms of people and to execute this?
Yes.
I mean, I think that it's,
people and the systems around them. So from capacity to capable systems.
I'd say part of the systems part, we've actually partnered with a group called Schneider Electric, and they've done a great job at really being able to roll this out through our portfolio. And the challenge for us is, give or take, we have a $60 billion portfolio of assets in Asia, so it's not small. And so being able to actually go do that and roll it out through all those different properties is no small challenge. And so that by itself is a pretty big initiative. And I think the other thing is, unfortunately, you look at the growth of this is like everything these days. You look at all the tech companies trying to find engineers. Unfortunately, there just aren't enough for the demand globally. And so I think that increasingly what you have to do is you have to bring in people and train them yourselves. And I think that if I look at our business, we kind of call it an apprenticeship business anyway, in our investing business. But I think all aspects like this are becoming that, because unfortunately, a lot of these jobs maybe didn't exist in the scale that we're talking about today 5 years ago. So fundamentally, if you want somebody with 15 years experience, there aren't that many. So you have to bring them up and train them and bring them up in the organization. And increasingly, we're doing that with younger people, new hires, train them on the job. Otherwise, it's really hard to get it executed.
Joris, what do you do?
It's very similar. Yeah. So we have a very extensive range of trainings which go from basic information dissemination on the SDGs to collaboration with universities. So we work a lot with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, but also here in Singapore. So there is the Singapore Green Finance Center, which is collaboration between financial sector institutions and SMU and Imperial College. But we also work with NTU and NUS. We contribute to programs that they have for their undergrads, for their postgrad studies, where we supply kind of the case studies and the practical incentives to help train the future talents that will come on board and work with us. But we're also investing a lot in training the existing workforce. Again, going from very basic information to more complex product knowledge, the green financing, sustainable financing that exists, ESG risk assessment. We're currently running a large campaign worldwide in BNP Paribas to train all our employees on ESG risk assessment of our own business, but also our clients, that will contribute to an even better assessment, management of those risk exposures. And it's important, it's ESG, right? So of course carbon is an element of it, but it's also, it goes as far as diversity and inclusion. All of this is taken into account. So really creating an awareness across the firm of all these issues and the impact that it will have, and not only immediate, but also in the medium and long term. As was said earlier, not everything will be resolved tomorrow, not all the problems will arise tomorrow, so we really have to have a long-term view of the sustainability of our business, and that needs to, so that we make informed decisions about the future of our firm.
Well, if I might just say, to me, ESG is very yesterday. I think you've got to look at it through the lens of SDGs, because that's where issues of diversity, inclusion, justice, empowerment come in. ESG was never set up with a value base behind it, whereas the SDGs are a much tougher reach. But I think if you're looking at investing in new capabilities or renewing capabilities, we've got to go beyond the ESG framework. That was, anyway, that's a very biased UNDP point of view, but I think I've got a group here that very much would support that. Darian, for us, a central bank network and supporting central bank capabilities, as I mentioned earlier, to me, the Monetary Authority of Singapore is way ahead than many. What can MAS do to kind of also build capabilities in that whole network of central banks?
Thank you. So, Joris has mentioned a number of the collaborations that are happening at the moment with different higher learning institutes here in Singapore. NUS just announced last week, I think, the Masters in Green and Sustainable Finance. So that will be for, yes, people in Singapore, but obviously we would love to be able to attract people from throughout the region and indeed the world to come and do these programs. We're seeing a very high demand for people who need to build their skills quite rapidly in these areas. And it could be that they have the sustainability experience, but not the financial experience. They could have the financial experience, but not the sustainability experience. And then there could be anything else in between. And so you do need to have this vibrant ecosystem of the different options for how people enter into these different education systems. Now, I mentioned before the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which does have so many central banks around the world as members, and there is actually a working group or a task force on building training and capabilities and capacity. And so that is specifically focusing on what can the central banks do to help to train their staff on these issues. And I think your point about ESG versus sustainability is important. I mean, we're looking at, okay, how do we move beyond green and what is that sustainable future? But there is already a network, and I think if we're looking at the whole question of how do you green the financial system, yes, central banks have a role to play, but obviously there's the private sector as well. And so it's making sure that we can all tap into those different streams to build capacity and capabilities.
Let me check before we close if there's any question. Yes, please.
Morning. My question's on stranded assets, and we talk about human capital in particular. So at the tip spear of the whole ESG equation, of course, you have a dearth of experience and talent. Like you say, 15 years. How can we find those people? But I think they are. We just have to pay a lot more. Then at the early stage, I suppose kids and millennials and all that are quite in tune with the ESG, and they go for trainings and universities and so on. But of course, maybe the younger kids, we need to have ESG literacy as part of education beyond financial literacy and all the other stuff that we're teaching them. But in the center, there's lots of people in the 30s and 40s in industries that are transitioning. Because I'm not sure what are the plans for this group of people. It's not quite obvious that they can sign up for courses and they can pivot to become new economy talent, so to speak. I find that quite far-fetched, at least from experience. So I'm not sure what's the plan there, or you have any ideas of, or whether it's policy or from a private sector view, how we can help enable some of this transition for this talent. Mm-hmm. The second question is more practical and tactical. In terms of companies having carbon pricing internally, how do we encourage them? Short of governments having mandates and having carbon pricing, and of course that sort of force fits into the various parts of economies. But in countries where they don't have such a thing, how do we encourage companies to have internal carbon pricing? Have you seen anywhere where it's done successfully?
Perhaps just going back to my previous experience before MAS, I was in the corporate sector. And just to go to the training and skills, I mean, corporates, certainly the big corporates, have been working on sustainability. Less ESG. ESG tends to be when you're talking about the data points and those impacts. Businesses have been talking about sustainability and aligning with the SDGs for a long time. And I think it goes back to a comment at the start. It's not how do you get the sustainability team to do sustainability. It is how do you look at your business to come up with a new sustainable model. And then everybody within that business is working in a different way, which is a more sustainable way. And so it is on-the-job training, it is skills training, but for how this business will run and its future forward. And for them, it's a matter of managing their risks. They can see that these risks are coming. How will they be a profitable and sustainable business over the long term? That will mean that they need to have the business future-facing, and they need to have a workforce that is able to deal with those capabilities and the change in functionality that they will need. And so I do think it's happening. I don't say that this is a discussion for the financial sector. It is a discussion for global sectors, and I think you've got pockets of good practice happening everywhere. What we need to do is just make sure it's not pockets, it's what everybody is doing. Mm.
And if you look at labor as such a high value asset, we certainly don't want to have a large part of that labor force as a stranded asset. Mm. I mean, it's not just coal-fired plants that are stranded assets, right? It's people. And if you put people at the center of the equation, investments there is going to be a critical piece. You're right, that middle gets lost. And it's a huge piece, but that's a larger part of public policy and education. Yeah, that is key.
It's the whole movement of reskilling, right? It's not only about SDG, ESG, but it's, right. For example, also technology has a huge impact. Yeah. And so I think as responsible corporate citizens, it's incumbent upon us to provide to all our colleagues, our employees, the opportunity to constantly upgrade their skills, reskill, and to make the workforce future ready. And as Alan was saying earlier, a lot of this experience does not exist because it's new. So we need to provide the means to the workforce to acquire those skills and to implement them in their daily lives as these things evolve.
Yeah. So as we close, what I'm going to ask all three of you to do is step out of your institutional hats for a moment. So now it's just Joris and Darian and Alan. And I want from each one of you just one big, crazy idea. If you can say, if all things I could do, this is the one that I am going to put my energy and effort and excitement behind, what would that be? So not from your institutional hat, but everything you know, because you bring a huge wealth of experience and knowledge to this. What would that be? Alan, I'm going to start with you.
I think it's actually, Darian mentioned this earlier, I think part of it's, if you look at the technology that's going to make a difference for us in this sector going forward, most of it hasn't been created yet. So it's almost, most of the technology
created yet
we're going to use for this to combat all these issues hasn't actually been created yet. So I think a lot of it's the innovation, almost the venture capital in a lot of ways for these up and coming technologies that will make a difference. For example, if you look at making some of these things, unfortunately, I don't think coal power plants are going to go away tomorrow. It would be great if they did, but can we go make them less polluting? Can we encourage other initiatives? Can we make things operate in a more efficient manner so that the damage is lesser as we make the progression? Because it'll be a progression, unfortunately, because we can't just cut over in one day. What can we be doing there? So I think that technology will play a big role here.
And so venture capital that goes into things we haven't even thought about yet, but which are going to make the change and make it faster. Darian.
So mine would be to bring optimism into the discussion of the future. We see so much of this dystopian future, but we are all the engineers of our future. We want a just transition. We want people to have access to food, to water, to energy. We want a clean environment. Actually, we know what we want. So how about we start working towards that now with that end point in mind?
Very well said. Joris.
Combining the two, I think where there's really an enormous need is access to information on the ground. Before my posting here in Singapore, I was in India for a number of years, and there's a lot going on the ground, but it's just very, very difficult to link that really, feet on the ground, action in the field to what we are doing here. And I think there's still an enormous amount of work to do to link those both worlds and to give access to the people on the ground to what we are doing here. I think that's probably the biggest missing link.
And I think that's a great way to end, because certainly for UNDP, it's that groundswell, right? It's really making sure that every citizen of this world just feels and pushes for this agenda. And that's the big kind of social agency push that's going to be needed to make it a positive, profitable, must-do agenda going forward. So thank you again to all three of you. Alan, Darian, Joris, really excellent conversation. Thank you very much to all of our audience and our participants online. Very much appreciated spending this hour with you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
We will now like to invite Mr. Niloy Banerjee, who is the resident representative of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore, and Darussalam, to share some closing remarks.
Yes, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you. What a stimulating discussion. Why did we get into this? Because, sorry, my name is Niloy, and I'm the representative for UNDP in Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei Darussalam. My boss is in the room, so there'll be no jokes don't even expect. We got into this because one of the things we have been having a conversation about is that the whole sort of green and sustainable and socially responsible discussion has focused a lot on fiscal policy instruments, taxes, and the light has never been shown on the monetary instruments and the role of monetary authorities, therefore. So I remember having a number of debates in the office because there was, of course, a school of thought that said, let's make it all financial instruments. I said, no, we must focus on monetary instruments alone and see what central banks can do. And I think that therein was the genesis of trying to get this together. I'm delighted to hear from you, Darian, that there is a network of central banks on this. So we've been wanting to have a conversation with a group of central bank governors and MDs about what is it that the monetary authorities can do to nudge. So first to thank my co-conspirator here, Lynette, Director General at the Foreign Ministry, to who I sent my first opening salvo and said, we want to do this. And Lynette moved the needle on this and really got the ministry involved. That's why they're co-sponsoring this. And reached out to the monetary authority first. And really got the momentum going here. So, I mean, what's clear from this conversation is, I mean, yes, there's a little bit of a perfect storm that Usha described in her opening, but we are kind of getting there also in terms of sort of getting our act together. A lot is happening, clearly. And Singapore so much leads this. In the last few days, we've met a series of your cabinet ministers, and from here we're now going off to meet the Deputy Prime Minister as well. And we were pleading that Singapore needs to feel a little less humble about this and get out, because if we share what's happening here, we'll shorten the learning curve for a lot of others that are struggling with these issues. I mean, carbon pricing is so difficult and politically so charged. So if Singapore is already moving ahead on it, why, can we share it very quickly with our neighbors here? So one of my big takeaways is this notion that this is not just a national public good issue, it's a regional and global public good issue, and all of us, all our boats will rise or sink with what we do. Certainly climate change and the oceans and temperature rise and glacial melt are not confined problems. So great. I'm also struck by the plethora of approaches and models. It's very nice to see that different institutions, different organizations are trying different things. Some have dedicated focal points on sustainability, and yours, as you said, yours is more a distributed network within the organization. And some have late night walks. So truly great to see this sort of thousand flowers blooming, and then we're trying new things. Some will fail, some will work, the wheels will fall off, and we've got to go back to the drawing board. My countdown clock is ticking, but just a quick, I think there's a lot of, my third big takeaway is there's work to do. Carbon markets are imperfect, for sure. We talked a lot about taxonomy and measurements, and including measurement of impact, and that we aren't there because we don't know what, it's a known unknown. There's a lot out there, that still needs to be discovered, new technology, new ways of repurposing stranded assets, reskilling or upskilling, lack of data, and therefore the handicap of all managers in making decisions yeah, I think my plea here is really twofold: to keep not only as much of this work as possible, but also to work as a community, because we could easily have very large trees falling in the forest and no one would know. So just to keep a little bit of a community here that talks to each other and frequently. So that, yeah, we all share and learn and come to this conversation from at least some shared understanding, shared language, shared taxonomy. And the final piece, if I may, there's a reason I asked what is the conversation with your children. UNDP's research, our data, and this is fairly large-scale surveys, are saying there's 90% awareness among youths that this is a big agenda, and they want to do something about it. They don't know where to go. There isn't a one-stop shop or a one-stop portal, and I think if all of us could take a little bit of a pledge to really teach our children well. Sorry, Neil Young, but it's just that there is a relative to other continents, the groundswell of young people who will really be at the receiving end of some of the practices of the last century, and this is not quite there, and we need those platforms where children can have the conversations, children and youth really, and are able, and there are people to answer their questions or at least engage, and even if we don't always have the answers. But also there's a market logic to it, isn't it? They're the ones who will shape market signals of the future. You can already see a very discerning consumer movement that will buy if it's labeled this way or that way, or if your building is certified green. So with that, I'd like to just say my thank yous very quickly, with an eye on the clock. Once again, a huge thank you to the government of Singapore for hosting us and for jumping in with gusto, and really opening all sorts of doors. We've had very, very powerful conversations. To the venture cap community and the investment community here, the private sector, MAS, thank you very much, because we didn't have to ask twice. It was just a question of sending one invitation letter, and there was somebody made available and ready. So thank you for making the time. We've met a number of private sector sort of communities the last few days. And I was struck, by the way, by this, coming back to my obsession with the children question. At least two venture caps opened their speeches or PowerPoints with pictures of the children. So it's, I think we are not just doing we're not just trying to do it right, we're doing the right thing as well here. I'd also like to thank Kani for making this trip. It took convincing. 2.5 a day on the ground, back-to-back meetings, 24/7 switched on. And then, of course, the big 100-hour flight in and 100-hour flight back to New York. And to all of you who have hosted us, and my dearest colleagues, thank you so much. I see some Callum, Devauti. The others are outside running the pieces. Oh, our MC, thank you, Hilda. And yeah, who am I missing? And to you for all your hospitality. It's been a lovely, for me, a week, for Kani 2.5 days. I'm sorry Usha's not here. She had to run out for another meeting. But
truly enjoyed this. Please be in touch. Let's make that community and we'll make it happen. Thank you so much. And online audience, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niloy. So this brings us to the end of the session. And on behalf of the organizers, I would like to express our gratitude to everyone for spending this time with us today. Hopefully we would have learned quite a lot from all the valuable insights and thought-provoking discussions that we've heard today. So once again, thank you everyone, and I wish you all a fantastic rest of the week. Goodbye.